The most dangerous man in the realm could feel every heartbeat in his kingdom. Every pulse of blood through a vein, every shudder of a nervous breath, every rhythmic thud of a soldier's march. To Kaelos, the High Warden, the world was not a place of sight and sound, but a crushing physical roar of kinetic energy. He was the most powerful man alive, and he was being crushed to death by the sheer weight of humanity. And the woman they chained at his feet was the only person in the world he could not feel at all. When she finally broke, the world blamed her, not the man who had put her there. The fortress of Oakhaven did not sit upon the mountain. It was a jagged tooth of basalt bitten into the throat of the sky. It was a place of permanent lethal winter. Here, the wind did not howl. It shrieked like something being flayed alive. Inside, the walls were 10 feet thick, draped in heavy, dust-choked wool tapestries designed to muffle the slightest vibration. To the people of the lowlands, the High Warden was a god of iron and law. To himself, he was a man drowning in an ocean of invisible collisions. Kaelos's affliction was not madness, though the scars on his forearms, self-inflicted to ground his mind in a singular, sharp pain, suggested otherwise. He suffered from the kinetic resonance. He did not hear thoughts. He felt the friction of life. Every heartbeat of a guard in the hallway outside was a rhythmic hammer against his ribs. Every breath of a servant 3 floors below felt like a gust of wind against his raw, exposed nerves. He lived in a state of permanent, agonizing sensory overload. On this morning, Kaelos sat in his solar. The room was a tomb of gray stone, devoid of furniture except for a single heavy chair. He wore a blindfold of thick, treated leather to dull the visual flicker of dust motes, which to his hypersensitive nervous system felt like a hail of stinging sand. His hands were clenched on the stone armrests, his knuckles white, his body tensed as if braced for an explosion that never stopped happening. The heavy oak doors groaned open. The sound was a serrated blade dragged across Kaelos's spine. He flinched, a low, animalistic growl escaping his throat. "I told you," Kaelos hissed, his voice like grinding stones. "No one enters without a shroud." "The girl is shrouded, my lord," the captain of the guard whispered. To Kaelos, the captain's whisper felt like a handful of gravel being thrown into his ears. "She is the Penitent from the Siltlands, the archivist sent to catalog the Black Scrolls as the council demanded." Kaelos turned his head. Even through the leather blindfold, he felt the 2 guards, heavy, pulsing masses of heat and kinetic energy, their heartbeats thumping in a chaotic, irritating rhythm. But between them, there was a gap, a cold spot, a hole in the tapestry of the room. Her name was Lyra. She did not look like a threat. She wore the gray, tattered smock of a secular penitent, her wrists bound by a long, heavy chain that clattered with every step, a sound that made Kaelos's jaw ache. Her feet were bare, blue with the mountain's cold. Around her neck was a jagged iron collar, the mark of a political hostage whose life was only as valuable as the silence of her conquered kin. She was not a warrior. She was not a mage. What she was had survived by becoming less than a person. She had spent her life in the lightless basements of the great library of the South, learning the art of erasure. Kaelos stood. He moved with a predatory, disjointed grace, his body tensed. He walked toward her, his head tilted, trying to find the pulse of her presence. Usually, when a person stood this close, their blood flow sounded like a rushing river in his ears. But Lyra was quiet. Not a soothing quiet, but a dead, stagnant silence. It was the silence of a tomb. What no one understood was that silence could be just as violent as noise. "Speak," Kaelos commanded. "I am here to work, my lord," Lyra said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the melodic weight Kaelos was used to. It carried no vibration of hope, no tremor of fear. It was a vacuum. Kaelos recoiled. The absence of resonance from her was as jarring as a sudden scream. It made his inner ear throb with a sharp, stabbing pain. "Why can I not feel you?" he demanded, his hand flying to his temple. "Are you a ghost? A construct?" "I am a survivor, my lord," Lyra replied, her eyes fixed on the frost-patterned floor. She did not look at him with pity or terror. She looked at him as if he were a weather pattern, something dangerous but inevitable. In the Siltlands, we learn to hold our breath until the world forgets we are there. Perhaps I have simply forgotten how to let it out. Kaelos's lip curled. "You are a void. A hollow thing. You disrupt the air in this room more than a screaming child." He turned to the captain. "Put her in the North Archive. If she speaks to anyone or if she leaves that tower without an escort, kill her. I want her as far from my senses as the stone allows." Lyra was led away. She did not protest the chains. She did not ask for food or warmth. She simply walked, her footsteps making no sound on the stone, leaving Kaelos in a room that suddenly felt too loud, too heavy, and dangerously unstable. For the next 2 weeks, the North Archive became a place of frozen study. The room was a circular tower, filled from floor to ceiling with scrolls that had not been touched in a century. The air was thick with the scent of cedar, rot, and the sharp tang of old ink. Lyra worked with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. She did not eat during the daylight hours. She did not sleep more than 4 hours a night. She lived in the silence of the scrolls, hiding the truth of her nature. She was not quiet by choice. Her body was a natural sink for kinetic energy. She absorbed the world around her, dampening the vibrations of life to keep herself hidden from the predators of her youth. Kaelos, driven by a mixture of agony and a dark, obsessive curiosity, watched her from the shadows of the high gallery. He hated being near her. The void she carried didn't heal his pain. It distorted it. When she was in the room, the resonance of the rest of the castle didn't vanish, it warped. The heartbeats of the guards became irregular, thumping like dying birds. The wind against the tower sounded like a dissonant, broken chord. One evening, the pressure in Kaelos's head became unbearable. A storm was rolling in from the coast, and the change in atmospheric pressure felt like a mountain was being lowered onto his skull. He burst into the archive, his blindfold discarded, his eyes bloodshot and wild. Lyra was standing on a high wooden ladder, reaching for a scroll. "Make it stop," Kaelos roared, his voice cracking the silence of the room. Lyra turned slowly, her expression vacant. "I cannot stop the storm, my lord." "Not the storm, you!" Kaelos stepped forward, his movements erratic. "When you are here, the world is wrong. The echoes don't return. It's like standing on the edge of a cliff in the dark. You are unmaking the air." Kaelos did not realize that touching her would feel like dying. He reached out, his hand trembling. He intended to seize her, to shake her, to force some kind of human resonance out of her hollow shell. But as he moved into her immediate space, the interaction between his resonance and her void triggered a violent sensory blackout. The air between them seemed to shimmer and collapse. Kaelos didn't feel a touch. He felt a total, instantaneous deprivation of all senses. No sound, no heat, no weight. For a second, he was erased from existence. He let out a strangled cry of pure terror and lunged forward. His weight slammed into the ladder. Lyra fell. Kaelos didn't catch her. He was too busy collapsing to his knees, his hands clawing at his ears as the silence of the collision sent a feedback loop of white noise through his brain. Lyra hit the stone floor with a sickening thud. Her head snapped back against the base of a shelf. The silence that followed was absolute. Kaelos gasped for air, his vision swimming. He looked down at her. She lay crumpled in the gray dust, her forehead bleeding, her eyes open but unseeing. For the first time since he had met her, he felt a pulse from her, but it was a weak, fluttering thing, like a candle flame in a hurricane. He didn't feel sympathy. He felt a profound, shivering unquiet. "Get up," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Get up and fix it." Lyra didn't move. The void she carried was leaking. The room began to grow unnaturally cold. A thin layer of frost began to climb the bookshelves, fueled by the kinetic energy she was no longer able to absorb and contain. Kaelos fled the room. He left her bleeding on the floor, unable to endure the cold of her presence for another second. He told himself she was a prisoner. He told himself she was a spy. But the next day, the fortress had changed. The servants were uneasy. Objects in the kitchen would fly off shelves for no reason. The hounds in the kennel refused to eat, whimpering and staring at the North Tower. The void Lyra carried was no longer a shield. It was a wound that was bleeding into the environment, causing the very structure of Oakhaven to tremble. Kaelos stayed in his solar, drinking heavily to dull the vibrating world. He refused to see her. He refused to send a physician. He convinced himself that if he ignored her, the silence would go back to being a hole instead of a threat. He was wrong. The King's Council arrived 3 days later for the winter solstice. The Great Hall was filled with the most powerful and the loudest men in the realm. Their minds were a chaotic roar of ambition, their bodies a heavy mass of kinetic greed. Kaelos was forced to preside. He was dying. The noise of 100 nobles was like a physical weight crushing his lungs. He could barely breathe. He could barely see. In a fit of desperate, agonizing selfishness, he ordered the guards to bring the Penitent to the hall. "Chain her to the pillar behind my chair," Kaelos commanded. "I don't care if she can stand. Bring her." Lyra was dragged in. She was pale, a bandage wrapped around her head, her eyes glazed with pain. She could barely walk. They shackled her to the stone pillar directly behind Kaelos's seat. As she was brought close, Kaelos felt the pressure in his skull ease. Her void acted as a sponge, soaking up the kinetic roar of the room. He let out a long, shuddering breath of relief. For the first time in years, he could think. But he didn't look at her. He didn't see the way her hands were shaking, or the way her iron collar was beginning to glow with a faint blue static. The High Priest of the Sun rose to offer the solstice toast. He raised a heavy, crystalline chalice filled with wine. "To the Warden!" the priest shouted. "To the man who holds the echoes of the world in his hand." The crowd cheered. 100 voices, 100 hands clapping, a massive, sudden surge of kinetic energy. Lyra's void was already at its limit from the injury and the proximity to Kaelos's own flaring power. The surge of the crowd's energy hit her like a tidal wave hitting a glass wall. The void shattered. There was no sound. There was only a sudden, violent displacement of reality. The crystalline chalice in the priest's hand didn't break. It imploded, the wine turning into a fine, bloody mist. The heavy chandeliers didn't fall. They were sucked upward toward the ceiling before being slammed back down with the force of a falling star. The guests were thrown from their seats by a concussive wave of pure, silent force. Kaelos was slammed forward onto the table, his nose exploding in a spray of blood. He looked back, his vision blurred. Lyra was slumped against the pillar, her eyes rolled back in her head. The iron chains around her wrists had been snapped like thread. The stone pillar she was shackled to was covered in a web of deep, black cracks. The high priest scrambled to his feet, his robes shredded, his face contorted in terror. He pointed a shaking finger at the unconscious woman. "Witchcraft!" the priest shrieked. "She has attacked the council! She has tried to assassinate the warden with the dark silence!" Kaelos tried to stand, to say that he had been the one who brought her there, that it was his own gift that had caused the feedback. But the words wouldn't come. His throat was choked with the copper taste of blood and the crushing weight of 100 accusing eyes. The guards descended on Lyra, their swords drawn. They didn't see a victim. They saw a weapon that had finally gone off. As they dragged her into the dark, Kaelos finally understood the truth. The silence was never empty. It was holding him together. And now, it was gone.